It's time to gather your strength and sharpen your wit, for in this review we're diving into Worldbreakers, Advent of the Khanate. In this game, it takes place in an alternate history where a strange material known as Mythium has been discovered. It provides magical properties, and those with the title of Worldbreaker seem to be able to harness it to its full potential. Now, you will take on the role of one of these Worldbreakers. Some of them you may recognize. So, you'll go head to head using Mythium, followers, and locations in order to gather up more power before your opponent. Do you have what it takes to earn the title of Worldbreaker? Let's find out. Here we have the battlefield for Worldbreakers set up. The goal of this game is to get 10 power by the end of the round, meaning that if you hit that requirement mid-round, gameplay will continue until the very end, in which case you'll see if a win condition has been met. If only one player has 10 or more power, that player wins. If both players have 10 or more power, then whoever has the most wins, and then if there's a tie, or if neither player has 10 power, you will then go into the next round. Now, rounds consist of each player taking an action, using the board to divide the sides, starting with, for example, this side. That player will take one action, then it will become the other's player's turn to take an action, repeating back and forth until the final turn is taken, in which you hit the rally phase. The rally phase is not only where you'll check for victory, but you'll also gain some extra resources, in which case you will then flip the round token over, starting with the new first player, which will always be the person who took the last turn. But now let's actually talk about those actions. The first two are very simple: gaining a Mythium, the currency of this game, or drawing a card. The next action you can take is paying 2 Mythium in order to increase your standing in a guild. You can gain standing in any of the guilds. However, for the pre-constructed decks, they are all monocolored, so really you're probably only going to care about one guild if you use the pre-constructed versions. Now, guilds become important as well as Mythium when it gets to the next action you can take, which is playing cards. Cards come in 3 types. There are followers, locations, and then events. To play these cards, you must pay the Mythium cost in the corner, as well as meet the guild requirements listed there. There are neutral cards. So for example, this card is playable right now, as you only needed 1 standing, and you also have the resources. This, while you have the Mythium, requires 3 in the Earth Guild, which currently this player does not have. Playing events, quite simple. You play them one time and then they are discarded. Followers, like this one and this one, will stay out afterwards and are important for blocking an attack. Finally, when you play a location, you're going to put a number of stage counters on it equal to the number of stages it has. As long as there are stage counters on it, it stays on the field. But as an action, you can remove a stage counter to trigger the topmost ability that no longer has a stage counter. So in this case, you would do gain 2 Mythium and a power, but if I remove the next one, I would do the gain 2 Mythium and gain a standing with any guild. If at any time a location has no more stage counters, it is removed from the board. The action to remove a location with stage counters is called developing. However, there are other ways that counters may be removed. And that is where we're going to hit the final action, attacking. Attacking is one of the main ways to get power, as well as trying to hurt your opponent's resources. So let's add another character here, just for the sake of this example. Now, you will choose your attackers by exhausting them, signaling these are the followers you wish to attack. Once attackers are declared, the defending player, one at a time, will exhaust one of their characters if they choose to block one of the opponent followers. If they do choose to do so, the characters will do damage to each other. So let's say these two decide to block, then 1 damage will be dealt to that one, and 1 damage to the other, as well as they both have a strength of 1, which is the sword black symbol there. The red symbol is their health. If they ever meet or exceed that in damage, they are defeated and are then put in the discard pile. After the opponent is finished declaring blockers, then you're going to check the outcome of the combat. If any attackers are able to make it through, they have breached your opponent's defenses and had a successful attack. You'll then perform the following steps. First, for every attacker that made it through, you're going to gain 1 power. Then you're going to trigger any cards that have the keyword breach. Finally, you're going to damage a location an opponent has control of. Choose one and remove one of its stage counters. It does not trigger that stage, so this is a great way for them to lose one of those abilities, or if it's on its final one, just remove the entire location from the field. After completing one of these many actions, it will then move back to your opponent, and as I said, go back and forth, hitting the rally phase, until someone has hit 10 power. Keep in mind that there are keywords as well as your Worldbreaker. The card's been sitting there and you may have been wondering what they do. Well, each deck will be led by one of 4 Worldbreakers in this core set. Each one corresponds to one of the guilds and they all have their unique powers. This deck, for example, is being led by Kutalun. Now currently they don't directly enter the battlefield, however they do have strong powers that you'll always want to keep track of. As mentioned, the core set comes with 4 Worldbreakers as well as preconstructed decks for each of them, representing the 4 current guilds in the game. Now you can make your own deck, simply choose one of the 4 Worldbreakers to represent your deck, and you may pull cards from any of the 4 guilds. Do keep in mind though that each Worldbreaker does come with some signature cards that only they have access to. Now, besides playing either with the pre-constructed decks or constructing your own, there are 2 other ways to play this game. First, there's the draft. The way drafting works is each player receives a copy of every Worldbreaker as well as their signature cards. The core set will come with 2 copies of each signature card and Worldbreaker, so enough for 2 people to draft against each other. Then take 1 copy of every card, shuffle them together, and this becomes the main deck you'll be drafting from. You will start by placing 3 piles of 3 in the center. Now, the first person will look at the first pile. If they like that, they can take all the cards, adding 1 card to the pile that they took from, and end their turn. However, let's say that the person didn't like this pile for whatever reason. Instead, they can skip onto it looking at the next pile. For each pile you skip, add a card to that pile. If you decide to skip all 3 piles, you'll then draft a card from the top of the deck. Gameplay will continue until this deck runs out and you have drafted all the cards. Make your decks and then play as you normally would. Then there is the campaign mode for solo play. This will actually follow the characters, mostly the Worldbreakers, within the story of this actual universe. They'll explain what's going on, what's happening a little bit, and why some of these characters may be butting heads. Now, the first chapter has you play specifically with Marco Polo. In fact, the story modes will have you use a specific deck, as well as one for your enemies, and a draft deck that you use. At the end of the chapters, you'll have the chance to get some more cards in there in order to increase the power of your deck. Now, in this core set, you will actually change sides with playing as Marco Polo through the first half, and then playing as a different Worldbreaker in the second half. As more sets are released, there'll be more chapters that follow this storyline, which of course will change which characters you can use, what cards are available, and of course the normal story beats of what's going on. Play-wise, it's mostly pretty similar. You'll have your own deck on your turn, you'll be taking actions back and forth, you'll be doing mostly the same thing, playing cards, trying to hit the objective, where that will change quite a bit depending on chapter. For example, you only need 6 power to win this chapter. When it hits the AI's turn, if they're on turns 1 and 3, you're going to do the card that says 1 and 3 on turns. Usually, that will be playing a card from the top of the AI's deck. On turns 2 and 4, you're going to do the other side, and most often than not, that is attacking. Keep in mind though, some cards are special, which may have unique powers, and as you progress through the chapters, this deck, as well as the AI's deck, is going to evolve and become more powerful, just as you are with the draft cards. Should you meet the objective for that chapter, you will then flip over, follow the steps, which usually are drafting, adding the extra cards to the AI's deck, and then usually read the little flavor text for the next chapter. You will keep going until you finish part 1, like I said, revolves around Marco Polo, and then in part 2, build the new decks, follow that Worldbreaker, and see how the story concludes for the core set. The first thing I want to quickly go over is my use of the word core when describing this. It doesn't say that on the box, it simply says Worldbreakers, but that is because this is an ECG, or LCG if you're familiar from Fantasy Flight. That means it is designed with the idea this will grow and expand. Another Kickstarter for the first expansion is already, depending on when you're watching this live, so it's definitely going to become more than what is included in this box. Now, I'm going to be looking at it just what's included here, and while I know a couple things from the expansion, it's not really enough that I feel is worth bringing up too much here, so do keep that in mind as one, my thoughts are mostly going to be what's included in here and my thoughts on how it's built, and that it may become a bit outdated as more expansions are released. Now, in terms of the core gameplay, that is going to be the head-to-head style combat. And when you see a lot of the mechanics, they're definitely things that you may recognize from other card games, but the big shining thing to me that makes it stand out is the board in the center, the round board that keeps track of your actions. There are many card games, and usually you play all your stuff on your turn, then your opponent does all their stuff, back and forth. Here, you really get one, maybe two things to do on a turn, then it's your opponent's turn. What that does do is it doesn't shorten gameplay time. You'll still have plenty of analysis paralysis and people trying to think, what's that perfect move I can do? But in other card games, one of the strongest things you can do tend to be things that can do outside of your turn, in essence, responding to your opponent. This has interrupt, instant, those kind of keywords. Here, it's almost like a majority of things have those keywords because I can play creature or follower in this case, and then you on your turn are like, okay, he did that. In response, I'm going to either get another blocker, or if I'm playing the specific guild, I might have a way to respond specifically to that follower. It feels like almost every action you take can be responded by an opponent, so you have to be a lot more careful in how you plan out your turns. And then while you're thinking about this back and forth, every other round, you're going to be able to get 2 turns in a row. And I feel mastering that 2-turn moment is what's going to separate the masters of this game versus those who play more casually. I really felt like that was where I can see my master strategy. If I can point out a time where I think I really gained the upper hand, more often than not, it was when I was able to abuse that back-to-back turns. Now, this comes with some pros. As I said, almost every deck can sort of respond. It's not technically instant, but it's pretty damn close to the opponent's moves. But I will say that this does hurt a little bit when it comes to some of those more simpler actions. I listed them all out before, and like in Android Netrunner, you actually have actions you can do regardless of what's in your hand or what's on the field. You can simply draw a card or gain a resource or even go up in a guild. Though that guild one, I think, is it's a bit more dependent on your deck, because if you're playing a multi-gilded deck, that is going to be an extremely important action. But going back to just resource and draw, Netrunner had something similar. But in Netrunner, you, depending on if you were the runner or the corporation, had multiple actions on your turn. So if you spent an action because you needed that one extra credit, it didn't feel too bad. Here, if you do that one extra credit or card draw, that's it. You're almost giving your opponent 2 turns in a row. And like I said, the actual 2 turns in a row feels like where you're going to master things. So it feels a bit more worse here, as you feel like you're giving your opponent quite the leg up. And that is only exacerbated if you need to spend 2 of your turns in a row to get resources, just because your deck tends to brick itself or become not very playable. It's unfortunately something that is going to happen. I don't want to say common, but it's a bit more likely because of the way that decks are built. This is a singleton format, meaning that each card is unique. You can't stack up your deck and make sure you're guaranteed to hit that specific card, which is very helpful, as if that was the case in this game, then you'd probably need multiple core sets because, that one staple card you need 4 copies of. But it does mean that sometimes you may come up with a hand of just followers or just locations that doesn't really work well for whatever your deck strategy is. It's not perfect, and there are ways to mitigate it, but it did come up every now and then. And because you, in essence, have to spend a whole turn trying to rectify the problem, those moments tend to leave a bit more of a sour feeling than some other times. Now, that isn't to say it's the worst thing in the world. And weirdly enough, that style of running out of steam or not having the right cards, I feel was a bigger problem in the solo mode rather than the head-to-head mode. And I think that's partially because the same thing can happen to your opponent. So those times when you feel bad because you got a resource don't always end with your opponent getting those 2 amazing turns. They might take that as a breathing time for them to draw a card and get a resource well. While the solo mode, you're playing against an AI that doesn't really worry too much about that, but I'll get to that in a little bit. When it comes to the cards themselves, thematically, really cool. I love the alt history theming. It does just enough that I feel it's a new, interesting, but recognizable past. In terms of the theming when it meshes with the mechanics, that of course will always come down to your colors, or in this case, guilds. They give you 4 guilds: Earth, Star, Void, and Moon. And with the pre-constructed decks, you can get an idea of how they're supposed to feel. Now, with future sets, I feel they'll really do a good job expanding them as well as making sure each one gets their own really individual flavor. But right now, I do feel the decks can sort of be grouped into two different groupings. First one being there's the offensive guilds, and then there's the defensive guilds. And within that, there's one guild that's a bit more of a basic one, and the other one a bit more complex and working about responding. The simpler ones, the Star and the Earth, I don't think they're weaker, but rather they're a bit more conditional and hoping of getting the cards they want in a certain window. Now, if you watch the interview, Ellie Amir did discuss how amongst the more experienced players, most of the decks had a near 50% win ratio. There wasn't an obvious winner and loser. But in my just general gameplay, I did notice the start deck really felt like you needed to have a pretty good starting hand because it didn't do well catching up, while the Earth deck was almost the opposite. It was usually fine with whatever it started with, but if it wasn't able to beat your opponent very fast, it would run out of steam relatively quickly. Meanwhile, the other two decks, which still play offensively and defensively, I felt like had a lot more ways to respond to your opponent, so they still felt like they had a reasonable power curve no matter what was going on through the game. Now, I want to make clear these are for the pre-constructed versions of the deck. You could probably fix a lot of these if you decided to change up the decks and just mix cards, even in just this set. What's really nice is, let's say I choose to play Marco Polo from the Stars. That doesn't mean I'm locked into just Stars and neutral cards because that's his color. He didn't lock it in similar to other card games we see, Commander from Magic the Gathering or One Piece, which define how your deck is built. You're allowed to go crazy, you just can't use other people's signature cards, and the payment is just making sure you're going to have more guild symbols, which is not the hardest thing in the world. So I don't think that there are too many restrictions when it comes to the idea of trying to leave the guild you're in. So that is something I think that can fix a lot of the issues. And like I said, it's not like the decks are terrible. I just felt like I had maybe a bit more fun and didn't feel nearly as walled off, I guess, in terms of reaching that win when it came to the decks I find a bit more complex, the Void and the Moon. Let's actually go into the solo one. As when I was talking about, you start off with Marco Polo in the campaign, and in the draft deck, you literally get Void cards. So it's quite easy for you to start mixing up. And if you feel, like I did, that your deck needs more answers, then the drafting makes it quite easy for you to get some of those answers. Now, mechanically, it's pretty simple. You're pretty much playing against an AI deck, like I said, that usually is playing a card, then attacking, playing a card, attacking. There are special ones that may boost a card or maybe hurt you if you've done certain conditions, but it's relatively just playing however the opponent deck you're supposed to be up against. Though what really got me excited about this is the fact that it didn't just feel like, here is an AI deck so you can play solo. This actually has a fun story along and explains why we actually have the Worldbreakers we're playing with. And I became interested and invested in what was going on. The cards themselves, the flavor text, this is seen in other card games, which is explaining what's going on. This will literally tag out if it's real or if it's part of the story. And then when you play the campaign, for example, playing with Marco Polo, there is a card called, I believe it's Frantic Getaway. But once you actually play the campaign, you're like, I know where that moment is. I know what's going on there. So it was really exciting to tie everything together to reward those who are the more thematic, maybe not competitive style players with a solid campaign. It was not just a quick throw-in for that solo mode. And even throwing the thing I mentioned before, how the solo mode feels like I can run out of steam or just have a really bad hand against the AI, I still had a lot of fun in trying to solve it and make my way through the entire campaign. Combine that with the draft mode, which while I didn't play too much of, I still found to be very interesting. Everything felt like it has so many different ways to play it, with none of them feeling like a quick add-on because you just want to make sure you can say 1 to 2 players, 1 to 4 players, whatever it is. Even with some of the issues that can come up and maybe some of the just sour moments, there is a lot here to be had. And if you are a fan of any card game, be it any of the LCGs, ECGs, or trading card games, I think you're going to have a lot of fun diving into the world of Worldbreakers. Crits and misses for Worldbreakers, Advent of the Khanate. Crits. The game provides multiple different ways for you to play, as well as pre-constructed decks that are easy for you to pick up and learn to play with. This makes it very easy for you to play this game in so many different ways, whether you want to play it the solo campaign and learn the story, keep the pre-constructed decks just so you can take this out for a game night, or if you want to go full competitive and try to build the strongest deck you can from these cards. The back and forth nature lets you respond almost always to whatever your opponent's going to do. You're never going to feel like you're guilty because you don't throw in enough of the interrupt style cards, as basically everything you do is an interrupt. But that means that you're going to have to be more careful as your opponent can respond to whatever you do, so you're going to have to be very careful watching your opponent's resources, playing your cards right, and of course, taking advantage of the times you get 2 turns in a row. I enjoy the alternate history here. I think it deserves itself as a crate in particular because the solo mode allows you to actually explore this world. Plenty of card games have flavor text that tells you what's going on, but here, combine the flavor text denotes what's actually in the real world or from the world of Worldbreakers with the actual campaign. You get to actually live in the world of Worldbreakers and actually see why these characters are worthy of that title. Mrs. While I praised it earlier for having the back and forth structure, I do admit that combined with the singleton format style can lead to some very underwhelming turns. Because you only can do one thing, if that one turn is just gathering a single resource or card because you can't really optimize your deck, then you're going to feel pretty bad as you're almost giving your opponent 2 turns in a row. Weirdly enough, this became more of an issue in the single player mode where the automaton deck doesn't really have a problem with running out of steam. When it seemed in the player versus player mode, it tended to happen to both players enough that usually it didn't become too much of an issue. Now, supposedly every pre-constructed deck in the top level of play have very similar win rates. I don't know if that's going to be the same the first time you play them. In particular, I found both the Star and Earth guilds really felt like they weren't weaker, but rather had very specific windows they needed their powerful cards. If they ran out of steam or fell behind, it felt a bit harder for them to play catch-up versus the other 2 guilds. That all said, this can be fixed by either doing your own constructed decks or hopefully with new expansions, giving those guilds some new tools to play with. This game, I believe, hits all the sweet spots that any cardboard slinger wants in a game. I think it does a good job providing you a fun variety of toys, but it gives you plenty of alternate modes, as if you get bored or if there's something more you'd like to focus on, it provides it, I think, in a very well-developed way. I think the world itself is very cool. It's not something I think is overused at all yet, and with that alternate history being just close enough to our timeline, but with Mythium, pushing it into the realm of fantasy a bit, it's enough to give you that bit you recognize while also giving you a taste of the new. Like I said, this was successful enough that they already have a new campaign either about to or already running or finished, maybe by the time you're listening to this. So it's a great time for you to hop on and try this game out. Let me know your thoughts if you've played Worldbreaker, if you're excited because you want to go more into the story, or do you want to go all in on the competitive and go to pro scenes and hopefully that a big tournament scene is made around this game. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below, as well as what is your favorite guild. But for now, I'm Will, and this has been a Roll for Crit review.